It was a quiet Sunday morning in the small town of Willow Creek, the kind of town where everyone knew each other's names and life moved at a measured pace. The streets were calm, a soft haze lingering over the sidewalks as the morning sun filtered through the old oaks lining the avenues. At St. Augustine's Church, a modest brick building with peeling white paint and stained glass windows, the faint murmur of parishioners greeting each other drifted through the air. People arrived slowly, some alone, some in small groups exchanging polite nods, quiet smiles, and the occasional handshake. It was an ordinary morning, the kind that had repeated itself for decades in the town, yet the hours that would follow would unsettle the community in ways no one could have anticipated. Among those arriving that morning was Maria Bennett, a widow of 42, whose life was as structured and predictable as the church bells that called the faithful to worship. Maria had become a familiar presence within the parish over the years, her quiet devotion observed by many who noted the serenity she carried even in times of sorrow. Her husband had died 10 years earlier, leaving her to navigate the routines of life with an almost ritualistic discipline. Every Sunday, she sat near the front pew, close enough to the altar to feel the warmth of the morning light as it poured through the stained glass, yet distant enough to preserve a sense of solitude during prayer. On that morning, she arrived with the same quiet punctuality she had always observed, her small handbag resting neatly on her lap, and a familiar scent of floral perfume trailing softly around her, a fragrance the congregation had long associated with her presence. The pews filled slowly, the choir began tuning their voices, and the low hum of the organ vibrated through the wooden floors. Maria lowered her gaze, clasping her hands in silent prayer. Hours passed in the usual rhythm of hymns and readings. Parishioners came and went, some lingering after the sermon to speak briefly with neighbors or the priest. By all appearances, the morning followed its ordinary pattern, nothing suggesting that anything was amiss. It was only when the service concluded and the last of the congregants began filing out of the church that the anomaly became apparent. People passed Maria's pew and assumed she had slipped out unnoticed, perhaps lost in thought or remaining behind for a personal prayer. But when the cleaning crew arrived an hour later, preparing to sweep the floors and arrange the pews for the week ahead, the unmistakable reality emerged. Maria Bennett was gone. Her handbag, shoes, and personal items were not in their usual places, and the faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air like a ghost of her presence. Yet she was nowhere to be found. The crew alerted the parish secretary, who immediately called the local authorities. Within minutes, police officers arrived, canvassing the church with meticulous attention that suggested both concern and disbelief. An initial missing person report was filed, cataloging her height, weight, hair color, and the distinctive floral scent that had become so strongly associated with her presence. Officers spoke to every member of the congregation who had attended that morning, collecting statements about where they had last seen Maria, whether she had mentioned leaving for any reason, or if they had noticed any unusual behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance. Friends described her as composed, quietly happy, and deeply committed to her faith, painting a portrait of a life governed by predictability and routine. There were no arguments, no recent travel plans, no signs of distress. Her disappearance, especially during the act of prayer in a public and familiar setting, defied comprehension. Outside the church, the town began to stir with concern. Willow Creek was a community that prided itself on familiarity and trust, and the sudden vanishing of one of its most consistent residents struck a chord of fear and disbelief. Neighbors retraced their steps, hoping to find a clue, scanning the streets, the nearby park, and the handful of paths that led into the surrounding woods. They knocked on doors, asked if anyone had seen her leave the area or noticed anything unusual. Police extended the search, deploying patrols to canvass the vicinity and coordinating with local volunteers. Despite these efforts, there was no trace of Maria, no footprints, no disturbances, nothing that suggested a struggle or hurried departure. It was as if she had simply evaporated from the world, leaving behind only a lingering perfume and a pew that now seemed painfully empty. Inside the church, the space she had occupied hours earlier felt heavier somehow, charged with a quiet, unsettling absence. Officers noted the odd stillness, the faint traces of fragrance that clung to the pews and floorboards. Parishioners who had returned to retrieve forgotten items commented on the subtle, almost imperceptible odor of her perfume, a scent that seemed out of place in her absence. It was the sort of detail that would later haunt the investigation, a clue that existed in the realm of the sensory and emotional rather than the tangible. As the day wore on, detectives began cataloging the events, questioning the subtle interactions and rhythms of the morning. They reviewed church attendance records, spoke to friends and family, and attempted to piece together a timeline that made sense. Yet, with each answer, more questions arose. How could someone disappear from such a public, predictable setting without leaving a trace? What unseen forces, practical or otherwise, could explain her absence? The town held its collective breath, unwilling to accept the simplest explanation, that Maria Bennett, a woman so rooted in routine, could vanish entirely without warning. By nightfall, news of her disappearance had spread throughout Willow Creek. Families gathered in living rooms, discussing the impossibility of the situation. Conversations were tinged with disbelief and fear. How could a devout, gentle widow disappear in broad daylight from a space dedicated to prayer and reflection? Authorities continued their efforts, but the first 24 hours passed with no leads, no sightings, and no answers. In that quiet, ordinary church, the pew where Maria had knelt remained empty, and the faint, lingering scent of her perfume hung in the air like a question the town could not answer. The disappearance of Maria Bennett during prayer had begun as a bewildering anomaly, but already it was taking on the shape of a mystery that would grip the community for years to come, setting the stage for a search that would challenge logic, patience, and faith itself. Within hours of Maria Bennett's disappearance, the quiet town of Willow Creek transformed from its usual Sunday calm into a hub of urgent activity. Local police, accustomed to minor disputes and lost pets rather than mysterious vanishings, mobilized quickly. Officers fanned out around St. Augustine's Church, meticulously retracing every step that Maria might have taken after her arrival that morning. They examined the pews, noting the faint traces of her floral perfume, the slight indentation of the cushions where she had knelt, as though the air itself were holding on to her presence. Every detail was recorded, catalogued, and photographed. Outside, patrol cars lined the narrow streets surrounding the church, officers walking the sidewalks, calling out her name, hoping for any response, however faint, from neighbors or passers-by. The immediate vicinity became a controlled zone of activity. Volunteers, drawn from the congregation and local community groups, joined the search, moving systematically through the streets in the nearby parkland. Groups were assigned sectors. Some checked the narrow alleyways, others the small wooded areas that bordered Willow Creek's residential blocks. The volunteers called out for Maria, their voices echoing in the early morning haze, reverberating through the air like questions with no answers. The local sheriff coordinated with the officers, establishing check-ins and assigning teams to ensure no area went unsearched. Street cameras were reviewed, and footage from nearby businesses and traffic intersections was collected. Every frame was scrutinized, hoping for the smallest clue, a glimpse of Maria, a shadow, or a car that might have stopped near the church. Attention soon shifted to Maria's home, a small, well-kept house on Maple Street, only a few blocks from the church. Police entered with care, scanning each room, noting the immaculate condition. The furniture was in order, her belongings neatly arranged, and her kitchen counters free of clutter. There was no sign of forced entry, no disturbance. Nothing to suggest she had packed to leave or planned to vanish. Officers checked her mail, her phone records, and her bank statements. Everything aligned with the life she had always led, predictable, orderly, and contained within the routines she had followed since her husband's death. Her personal calendar, left open on her desk, confirmed her daily patterns: morning prayers at St. Augustine's, trips to the grocery store midweek, and occasional visits to the library. There were no letters, no notes, no messages that hinted at fear or intention to disappear. The house itself offered a stark contrast to the chaos now engulfing the town, a testament to a life so structured it seemed impossible that its occupant could vanish without a trace. Officers began interviewing friends and family, piecing together the narrative of Maria's life and the rhythm of her routines. Her neighbors described her as punctual, polite, and unassuming, the type of person who could be counted on for small acts of kindness. A wave from the porch, a greeting on the street, a reminder to pick up groceries. Her closest friends recalled Sunday mornings spent together in quiet conversation after the service, usually centered around the topics of faith, books, or community projects. Her niece and nephew remembered weekend visits filled with small, unremarkable rituals, tea in the afternoon, stories exchanged in soft tones. None of these recollections suggested instability or conflict. No one had observed tension, fear, or anyone approaching her with suspicion in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The cumulative picture painted by these statements was consistent and unbroken. Maria lived a life that was secure, predictable, and grounded in routine. As the day progressed, the nature of the search began to shift in focus. Initially approached as a standard missing person case, the absence of evidence, combined with the implausibility of voluntary disappearance, raised new concerns. Investigators quietly considered the possibility of abduction. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry, no witnesses reporting a suspicious vehicle, and yet the facts refused to align with a voluntary departure. It was an unsettling proposition, one that cast a shadow over the town and transformed its collective anxiety into something more tangible. Officers debated scenarios. Could someone have followed her to the church? Was there a premeditated plan that exploited her routine? Each theory was weighed and cataloged, yet none produced a concrete lead. Community anxiety escalated alongside these deliberations. Willow Creek, a town where doors were rarely locked and strangers immediately noticed, now found its citizens gripped by fear. Conversations at grocery stores, diners, and in neighbors' yards centered on the impossible disappearance. Rumors circulated. Some imagined foul play, others suggested a voluntary but secret departure. Even those who tried to rationalize the situation were left with a creeping sense of dread, unable to reconcile the life Maria had led with the sudden, inexplicable void she had left behind. Volunteers continued their searches long after dusk, flashlight beams cutting through the thickening shadows of the park and streets. Calls to friends and family were repeated. Lists of her favorite locations cross-checked against tips from residents who believed they might have glimpsed her somewhere, though none were substantiated. By the end of the first day, the investigation had expanded to include specialized units. Detectives, missing persons, coordinators, and forensic teams began preparing for a more extensive examination of evidence. Each member approached the case with a mixture of professional focus and private unease. The incongruities were too stark. A woman with no enemies, no signs of distress, vanishing in a place where she was known and trusted. Maria's disappearance was already transcending a simple police matter. It had become an enigma that challenged the assumptions of safety, routine, and predictability in Willow Creek. Officers returned to the church multiple times, their footsteps echoing across the polished floors, searching for overlooked traces, for anything that might explain what had become the town's first profound mystery in decades. Even as night fell, the search continued, extending beyond the immediate perimeter of her daily routines. The area was combed again, volunteers paired with officers walking along every path she could have taken. The lingering scent of her perfume in the pews of St. Augustine's remained a haunting presence, a sensory reminder of her absence and the impossibility of the day's events. In homes across the town, families sat in quiet contemplation, imagining the disappearance of someone so ordinary, so familiar, and wondering how any explanation could reconcile the life she had led with the sudden terrifying void she had left. The initial search had concluded nothing definitive, yet it had set the stage for a long, methodical investigation that would strain the patience of authorities, the nerves of the community, and the resolve of anyone who had known Maria Bennett. The calm, predictable life she had lived had ended abruptly, leaving a question that none could yet answer, and the shadow of her absence stretched far beyond the church walls, reaching into the town's collective consciousness. The day after Maria Bennett vanished, investigators returned to St. Augustine's Church, retracing every step, inspecting the pews, the aisles, the entryways, searching for anything that could explain her disappearance. It was here they discovered her purse and phone, left deliberately on the same pew where she had been praying. Everything inside was intact: cash, identification, her library card, even the small notebook where she jotted down her daily reflections. There was no sign of struggle, no note demanding ransom, no indication that she had been coerced into leaving. Officers examined the surrounding floor meticulously. Dust, dirt, and pollen were collected for analysis, but the area remained eerily pristine, as if Maria had simply evaporated from the room. Footprints outside the church doors were absent, and the surrounding grass bore no disturbance beyond ordinary wear. The absence of any physical trace was unsettling, a gap that both perplexed and frustrated the professionals tasked with finding her. Forensic teams arrived to process the evidence, dusting the purse, the phone, and the pews for fingerprints and DNA. Swabs were taken and sent to the lab, but when results returned, they provided no clarity. Only Maria's own prints and traces were present, no unknown DNA, no sign of another person touching her belongings. Detectives combed through phone records, texts, and recent calls, hoping for an unexpected clue, but nothing suggested contact that could explain a planned departure or an abduction. Her last outgoing call had been to her sister the evening before, ordinary in tone and unremarkable in content. Everything about Maria's final hours at the church appeared ordinary, yet the impossibility of her absence screamed that something extraordinary had occurred. Church security cameras were reviewed with painstaking care. The system had been partially malfunctioning in the days before the disappearance, producing gaps in recording. What remained captured only the last frame of Maria kneeling in prayer, her hands folded and eyes closed. The moment froze her there, still and undisturbed, a haunting snapshot of normalcy on the day her life abruptly ended, or at least ended for everyone who knew her. No figure entered the frame, no shadow passed across her pew, nothing suggested a disruption. The footage, intended as a tool for clarity, instead became a haunting testament to the inexplicability of her vanishing. Investigators found themselves confronting the impossible. How could someone simply vanish in a location filled with people, recorded by cameras, leaving behind every personal item and yet disappearing entirely? Detectives began interviewing parishioners who had attended the service that morning. Many remembered Maria's familiar presence, her quiet devotion, her meticulous rituals. Yet a few recalled fleeting oddities, small details that at the time seemed insignificant, but now demanded attention. One woman mentioned a man who had lingered near the church entrance during the week prior, his behavior unsettling enough that she had taken note but never acted on it. Another parishioner thought she heard whispers in the nave during prayer, voices so soft that she questioned her own perception. Some recalled seeing shadows flicker across the pews, though no one could identify anyone in the church at that time. Each anecdote, fragmentary and ambiguous, was carefully logged, yet none pointed conclusively to a suspect or motive. Leads began to emerge sporadically, only to dissolve under scrutiny. Tips arrived from residents claiming to have seen a woman matching Maria's description walking along the riverbank or near the grocery store. Others suggested a car parked in unusual locations or a stranger asking questions about her routines. Officers pursued each possibility, tracing routes, canvassing neighborhoods, checking with local businesses, and following up with friends who had reported sightings. Almost uniformly, the tips yielded nothing. Witness accounts were contradictory, cameras failed to confirm any presence, and all physical evidence remained absent. The police files swelled with reports, diagrams, and suspect lists, yet the central question persisted. Where had Maria gone, and why had she left nothing behind? As the days passed, frustration within the investigative team began to build. Every new lead seemed to lead back to nothing. Detectives reviewed the evidence repeatedly, scrutinizing timelines and re-interviewing witnesses for inconsistencies. They retraced Maria's known routines, evaluating the possibility of secret trips or voluntary disappearance, but nothing suggested she had planned to leave. Friends and family offered only the same description: a woman bound by faith, by structure, by the small predictable patterns of her life. Her disappearance defied the ordinary rules of investigation. The town's collective logic strained against the reality that someone so anchored in routine could vanish without trace. Psychological profiles were drafted in consultation with behavioral specialists. Theories included abduction by an acquaintance, sudden flight, or even a rare medical event, yet each had significant gaps. There was no evidence of coercion, no signs of sudden panic or distress, and no unusual behavior noted in the days preceding her disappearance. Even the anomalies mentioned by parishioners, the man at the entrance, the whispers, the shadows, were too inconclusive to form actionable leads. Each theory required assumptions, leaps over evidence that simply did not exist. Investigators found themselves operating in a vacuum of certainty, left to weigh circumstantial fragments that refused to coalesce. By the end of the first week, the case had settled into an uncomfortable pattern: persistent searching, methodical interviews, and repeated dead ends. The absence of concrete evidence, coupled with the fleeting, ambiguous clues, created an atmosphere of escalating tension. Officers and family alike were haunted by the image of Maria kneeling in prayer, poised between worlds, leaving behind only her belongings, her scent, and the memory of a life that seemed solid yet had vanished in an instant. Every effort to reconstruct her final movements yielded only the sense of a puzzle missing crucial pieces. The tangible world provided nothing, and yet the intangible, the faintly remembered details, the whispers, the shadowy recollections, refused to let her disappearance feel complete, unresolved in both mind and community. Investigators were left to grapple with an unsettling question: how could someone disappear from a familiar public space, leaving behind all evidence of ordinary life? And why did the few fleeting anomalies they could document remain so maddeningly ambiguous? In the silence following each inquiry, the pulse of unanswered questions grew louder, echoing in the empty pews and vacant corridors of St. Augustine's. Every new tip, every minor anomaly, circled back to nothing, reinforcing a truth the town and the police could not ignore. Maria Bennett's disappearance was a mystery without resolution, one that would continue to haunt the church and its congregation for years to come. By the fourth day after Maria Bennett vanished, the atmosphere in the town had shifted from quiet concern to pervasive unease. Streets that had once felt familiar now seemed shadowed with suspicion and dread. Flyers with her photograph, neatly printed and laminated, were plastered on lampposts, store windows, and community boards, each one pleading for information or sightings. Social media erupted with theories, some plausible, others fanciful, yet all carrying the same undertone: the unthinkable had occurred here. Local news outlets ran segments, interviewing neighbors, co-workers, and friends, capturing tearful recollections of Maria's gentle demeanor and steadfast routine. The narrative coalesced into a portrait of a woman whose life seemed orderly, predictable, and devoid of conflict, making her disappearance all the more confounding. Residents scrolled feeds and listened to broadcasts with a mix of fascination and fear, debating endlessly what might have happened within the familiar walls of St. Augustine's Church. Maria's elderly mother, Helen Bennett, retreated into herself. Once a fixture at community events, she now sat for hours in her dimly lit living room, staring at a photograph of her daughter. Her grief manifested in silence, broken only by whispered questions. Where was Maria? Why had she vanished? And was she even still alive? Friends described Helen's sudden withdrawal from the outside world, her fixation on news reports, and the ritualistic checking of her daughter's voicemail and phone records, though each call returned only silence. The psychological weight of the unknown pressed heavily on her, manifesting in sleepless nights, fatigue, and an obsessive preoccupation with the minutiae of her daughter's daily life. Those who knew her described a grief that was quiet but all-consuming, a stark reflection of the larger community's anxiety. At St. Augustine's, parishioners spoke of Maria's presence as calming and gentle, her devotion steady even in times of personal sorrow. She had attended weekly services without fail, greeting fellow worshippers with a nod or a quiet smile, her voice never raised, her movements unhurried. For many in the congregation, she embodied serenity, a woman whose faith was both unshakable and humbly expressed. Her disappearance cast a long shadow over Sunday gatherings. Familiar pews felt emptier, the air heavier. And conversations were frequently interrupted by hesitant mentions of her absence. People shared anecdotes of her quiet acts of kindness, her unwavering attention to community members in need, and the subtle yet profound ways she had left an imprint on those around her. Each recollection deepened the town's sense of loss, highlighting the contrast between Maria's composed life and the chaos her absence had wrought. Psychologists consulted on the case, offering insight into possible explanations for the disappearance. They considered whether trauma, coercion, or voluntary action could account for the vanishing, weighing each against her known personality and routines. Experts noted that someone with Maria's consistent and faith-driven life was unlikely to leave without preparation, especially without notifying family or leaving a trace. Coercion or external pressure was deemed plausible, but lacked supporting evidence, while voluntary disappearance conflicted with the woman's documented attachment to routine, faith, and community. Specialists cautioned that the unknown elements were often the most significant in shaping outcomes, highlighting how even well-documented patterns could be disrupted under extraordinary circumstances. Their analyses, detailed and methodical, only intensified the town's collective anxiety, providing explanations that seemed logical yet incomplete, emphasizing uncertainty rather than resolving it. Within the police department, the case began to stagnate. Investigators had exhausted the immediate leads. Surveillance footage provided no new clues, forensic analysis revealed nothing beyond Maria's presence, and eyewitness accounts were fragmentary and inconsistent. Officers admitted privately that progress had slowed, and the possibility of encountering a breakthrough appeared increasingly remote. Public statements reflected this reality with careful phrasing, acknowledging the ongoing search while cautioning that the absence of evidence limited the likelihood of imminent discovery. For the town, these admissions reinforced the sense of helplessness, the knowledge that the mystery could persist indefinitely without closure. Rumors spread through the community, some grounded in observation, others purely speculative. A few residents claimed to have seen a woman resembling Maria walking at night in the outskirts of town. Others whispered about strangers asking questions near the church. These reports were logged and investigated, but invariably yielded nothing tangible. With each unconfirmed sighting, the tension in the town heightened, fueling both hope and dread. People began to navigate daily life with a subtle wariness, scanning surroundings for anomalies, reassessing familiar routes, and silently noting anyone whose behavior seemed unusual. The collective consciousness of the town had shifted, each individual influenced by the unresolved nature of Maria's disappearance and the fragility of what had once been taken for granted. By the end of the fourth day, the community was forced to confront a lingering uncertainty. Ordinary routines continued, but a palpable sense of vulnerability pervaded daily life. Parishioners, neighbors, and family members balanced grief with ongoing vigilance, striving to maintain normalcy while acutely aware that Maria Bennett's absence had created a void that could not be easily explained. Conversations often ended with unspoken questions, gestures lingered longer than necessary, and the faint scent of her perfume, still remembered by those who had been near her pew, served as a haunting reminder of a presence that had abruptly vanished. The town collectively acknowledged that, despite exhaustive efforts, the truth remained elusive, leaving a quiet but persistent unease that would shape their perception of safety, community, and trust for the months ahead. Months passed since Maria Bennett vanished, and St. Augustine's Church, once a place of quiet solace, began to feel charged with an unsettling presence. Parishioners returning for regular services reported noticing fleeting hints of Maria's perfume, delicate and unmistakable, lingering near the altar, along the aisles, or in the shadowed corners of the building. Some described catching the scent near the confessional, where she had often prayed, a fragrance that seemed to appear without explanation and then fade as suddenly as it arrived. These experiences were fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet persistent enough that multiple members of the congregation began to remark on the phenomenon during casual conversations, sharing similar accounts of an intangible reminder of Maria's presence. The descriptions varied slightly. One person said the air smelled of rose with faint hints of musk. Another spoke of the faint sweetness of vanilla. But the consensus was clear. The perfume, long associated with her daily routine, seemed to manifest at different points inside the church. Beyond scent, several parishioners reported visual anomalies. A few claimed to see her figure kneeling in a pew when the church was otherwise empty, the shape indistinct but familiar in posture and dress. These sightings were brief and easily dismissed as trickery of the mind, yet they occurred independently of one another, often corroborated by individuals who arrived at different times. One volunteer cleaning the nave late in the evening insisted that she saw the outline of Maria sitting quietly, hands clasped, head bowed, as though continuing the devotion she had never abandoned. These reports created unease, not fear, but a profound sense of dislocation. A place that had once felt secure now seemed porous, as if the boundary between the living and the missing had thinned. Father Thomas, the church's lead priest, publicly maintained a rational position. He spoke against superstition, emphasizing that faith and grief could create vivid perceptions in those still processing loss. Yet in private, he admitted to an unexplainable sense of presence during late-night prayers in the empty church. He described a weight in the air, a warmth or subtle movement that defied any rational explanation, leaving him unsettled despite his lifelong commitment to reason and theology. He never claimed to see Maria directly, but the sensation of being watched or accompanied when no one was present persisted, and he confessed to pausing mid-ritual, the hairs on his arms rising inexplicably, as he felt an awareness that could not be rationalized. Police officers and investigators, when approached with these reports, largely dismissed them as manifestations of grief and stress. They noted the natural human tendency to find meaning in absence, particularly when a community had been traumatized by a sudden and unexplained disappearance. Experts suggested that shared loss could amplify sensory perceptions, making faint odors and shadows feel significant. Yet detectives carefully logged each account, intrigued by the consistency across independent witnesses, the recurrence of both scent and vision in the same areas, and the specificity with which descriptions aligned. Although they did not consider these phenomena evidence in a legal sense, they acknowledged the patterns as noteworthy, hinting at a collective psychological imprint shaped by memory, routine, and emotional attachment. The community itself became divided. Some insisted that Maria's spirit lingered, a silent presence protecting the sanctuary she had loved, while others argued for purely scientific explanations, asserting that grief, routine, and imagination were responsible. Conversations in the local diner, on social media, and during church events were punctuated with debates about whether these experiences were real or imagined. Families argued quietly over interpretations, parishioners hesitated before sharing stories, and the clergy attempted to balance reassurance with acknowledgement of the congregation's unease. The duality of rational thought and superstition grew into a subtle tension that permeated daily life, leaving the town caught between faith, hope, and the desire for closure. Some parishioners began changing routines, arriving at different hours or lingering longer in the pews, hoping to encounter the sensation again, whether to confirm their memories or find solace. Cleaning staff reported hesitancy when entering certain aisles alone, noting the inexplicable intensity of the air in spots where the perfume had been strongest. Even casual visitors mentioned an emotional weight in the church that they could not attribute to architecture or acoustics alone. This gradual shift in the environment altered the community's relationship with the space. What had once been simply a house of worship became a location intertwined with mystery, memory, and the unspoken hope of reconnection. By the end of the first half year after Maria's disappearance, the phenomenon had become part of the church's collective identity. Families and individuals approached services with an acute awareness of absence, noticing the smallest details in air, light, and sound. Every creaking floorboard, every sudden gust of air, and every subtle fragrance carried significance. The missing woman, though physically absent, had left a perceptible mark that resonated across the congregation, shaping rituals, conversations, and emotional life. Even those skeptical of the occurrences found themselves affected, caught between disbelief and the subtle, undeniable traces of Maria's presence. The church, a place of prayer and community, now whispered her name in the quietest, most elusive ways, reinforcing the haunting reality of her disappearance and embedding her memory into the physical and emotional fabric of the town itself. Nearly a year after Maria Bennett vanished, the case remained dormant in public attention, filed away as a cold file with few active leads. The initial media frenzy had faded, and town life returned to its measured routines. Yet the absence of Maria lingered in quiet corners, whispered in conversations at the grocery store, and in the pews of St. Augustine's Church. It was during this prolonged period of inactivity that a retired detective, Leonard Hayes, who had once served in the neighboring city's homicide division, began reviewing open files and cold cases as a personal project. Hayes, meticulous and methodical in his approach, requested permission to examine the Maria Bennett file, hoping a fresh set of eyes might notice what had been overlooked. With the benefit of time and perspective, he scrutinized witness statements, logs, and incident reports for inconsistencies or overlooked connections. It was then that he turned to surveillance footage, not from the church, which had only partial coverage, but from a nearby convenience store whose cameras had recorded the streets surrounding the church area. Hayes discovered footage that had never been seriously analyzed. The grainy images captured a woman moving calmly along the sidewalk near the church several hours after Maria had last been seen during her Sunday service. She walked with a steady, deliberate pace, carrying nothing in her hands, her posture upright and composed. The footage was dimly lit, compromised by shadows and the distance between the camera and the street, and the woman's face was partially obscured by a hood and the angle of the lens. Environmental conditions, a thin drizzle that streaked across the camera lens and reflected the streetlights, further distorted the image, making precise identification challenging. Nevertheless, the figure's silhouette and gait bore a striking resemblance to Maria, enough to compel Hayes to push for closer examination and attempt digital enhancement of the footage. Analysts worked to clarify the frames, using contrast adjustment, stabilization, and advanced image reconstruction techniques, yet the results remained inconclusive. Facial features could not be verified, and minor details like hairstyle and clothing were muddled by light reflections and pixelation. Hayes documented each frame carefully, noting the woman's direction of travel, the relative timing compared to known events, and the environmental factors affecting clarity. Even with the enhanced footage, experts could not determine with certainty whether the figure was Maria or someone else entirely. The ambiguity of the images, however, was enough to reignite interest among both the public and law enforcement, prompting a new wave of speculation about her disappearance. Local news outlets picked up the story quickly, emphasizing the dramatic potential of the footage. Residents pored over screenshots, discussing possible scenarios on social media and in informal gatherings. Theories proliferated. Some suggested that Maria might have left voluntarily, choosing to vanish quietly, a decision unimaginable to her friends and family, yet rendered plausible by her measured gait in the video. Others proposed she could have been coerced or abducted at that time, the calm demeanor in the footage masking stress or fear. A smaller group wondered whether this could be an entirely different woman, her resemblance to Maria coincidental, leaving the community caught between hope and suspicion. The renewed attention placed strain on law enforcement, who faced renewed inquiries from the public and pressure to reopen the investigation. Detectives revisited old leads, canvassed witnesses once more, and attempted to cross-reference movements captured on other cameras in nearby streets, though the trail remained frustratingly thin. No new information connected the footage directly to Maria's disappearance, and forensic evidence had long since yielded no substantial results. Hayes, undeterred, maintained that even partial observations might hold significance, noting the importance of timing, location, and patterns that could be corroborated by overlooked testimonies or yet unexamined records. Family and friends responded to the footage with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Maria's mother, who had long carried the weight of uncertainty, watched the grainy video with tentative hope, imagining her daughter alive, capable of navigating the streets calmly, yet struggling with fear that it might not be her at all. Parishioners and neighbors debated the implications, recalling her routines, her predictability, and the incongruity of a seemingly deliberate departure hours after her last known appearance in church. Social media threads expanded with conjecture, expert commentary, and personal reflection, transforming a quiet small-town disappearance into a renewed conversation about chance, choice, and circumstance. The footage did not resolve the mystery, nor did it clarify the precise events of that Sunday. Instead, it layered additional complexity onto an already confounding case. Police acknowledged the value of new information, reopening inquiries in a limited capacity. Yet the evidence offered more questions than answers. Was Maria attempting to leave on her own accord, escaping an unseen danger, or had she been intercepted by someone who remained undetected? Could the figure captured in the grainy video even have been her at all? These questions persisted, amplifying the sense of unease in a town that had struggled to reconcile faith, grief, and uncertainty. Hayes continued to document his findings, quietly hoping that further investigation might eventually transform ambiguity into clarity, while the town waited, suspended between hope and the enduring shadow of the unknown. As the investigation into Maria Bennett's disappearance dragged into its second year, detectives returned to the town with renewed intensity, determined to revisit witnesses and re-examine even the smallest details that might have been overlooked. They scheduled formal interviews with dozens of townspeople, focusing on individuals whose records indicated prior minor offenses, habitual dishonesty, or behavior that had once drawn suspicion. Law enforcement hoped that careful questioning might surface overlooked connections or inconsistencies. Investigators moved slowly, emphasizing patience and observation, aware that even subtle shifts in tone or hesitation could reveal insights invisible in the initial sweep. Residents, many of whom had long since accepted the ambiguity surrounding Maria's disappearance, were startled by the renewed attention, some willing to cooperate, others defensive or weary. During these interviews, a handful of confessions emerged, but none related directly to Maria's disappearance. A local shopkeeper admitted to small-scale tax evasion, another resident confessed to embellishing minor accidents in reports years prior, and a teenager finally admitted a petty theft from a school event long forgotten. These confessions, while irrelevant to the central mystery, were documented meticulously, both to clear possible avenues of suspicion and to ensure thoroughness. Detectives treated each admission seriously, cross-referencing records and previous statements to eliminate any potential leads, but each thread ultimately circled back to the same unresolved question: where was Maria? Among the witnesses, one account drew heightened scrutiny. A man in his 40s, previously considered unremarkable, recalled seeing a stranger lingering near the entrance of St. Augustine's Church several days before Maria vanished. He described the figure as unassuming yet unsettling, claiming that he felt wrong about the man's presence. The detective team explored this lead carefully, attempting to verify the account against church attendance records and neighborhood observations. The stranger's description, vague and incomplete, yielded no matching identities in police records. No photographs, fingerprints, or corroborating witnesses appeared, leaving investigators with an impression of unease, but no physical evidence to follow. Despite the uncertainty, the account emphasized the sense of vigilance and anxiety permeating the town in the days leading to Maria's disappearance, reinforcing the idea that even ordinary places could harbor unseen threats. Detectives also consulted psychologists and behavioral analysts, aiming to construct a profile of both potential suspects and Maria herself. Specialists examined her routines, her social relationships, and the minutiae of her daily life, from church attendance to interactions at the library. Profiles considered whether voluntary disappearance, coercion, or opportunistic abduction could plausibly explain her absence. Analysts concluded that Maria's personality, marked by devotion, conscientiousness, and consistency, made the likelihood of her leaving willingly extremely low. Yet, without physical evidence, these conclusions remained theoretical, providing context rather than actionable direction. Law enforcement acknowledged the limits of psychological profiling, using it to inform the investigation without assuming certainty. Friends and neighbors contributed with personal recollections, emphasizing Maria's character. They spoke of her deep faith, gentle demeanor, and routine devotion to prayer. She was remembered as a figure who offered calm and solace to those around her, a person whose presence reassured and inspired. One parishioner recalled seeing Maria kneel for extended periods, quietly holding her intentions in prayer, a ritual she never abandoned even during minor personal difficulties. These accounts underscored the emotional gravity of her absence, painting a portrait of someone deeply rooted in the fabric of the community, yet now missing without explanation. Each story added emotional weight, but investigative progress remained stalled, as no new clues emerged to bridge the gap between remembrance and discovery. Detectives faced growing frustration as each interview ended with either trivial admissions or anecdotal reflections. Despite careful questioning, inconsistencies in recollections often emerged, attributable more to the passage of time and memory distortion than intentional deception. The case, painstakingly documented, revealed no direct links between any townspeople and the disappearance. Every avenue explored, every confession recorded, seemed to lead only to dead ends, leaving investigators to reconcile the meticulous evidence collection with the persistent void left by Maria's absence. The interviews reinforced the dual nature of the case, the tangible record of investigation juxtaposed with the intangible sense of loss that had settled over the town. Each narrative highlighted Maria's life and character, yet none provided a path forward for authorities. Friends and family carried a renewed mixture of hope and despair, knowing the thoroughness of the investigation, yet confronting the reality that the truth remained inaccessible. Law enforcement acknowledged the emotional power of these testimonies, but also their limitations, understanding that the threads of memory, intuition, and fear could illuminate character but rarely reveal location. By the end of the interview cycle, the detectives compiled a comprehensive dossier. Pages of statements, confessions, and personal recollections lined their files, a mosaic of human response to an inexplicable disappearance. The collective testimony conveyed the profound impact of Maria's absence on the town, capturing grief, speculation, and vigilance, yet simultaneously highlighted the emptiness of unconfirmed leads. The case remained unsolved, the emotional weight of her absence undiminished, and the mystery of her disappearance persisted as a silent, unresolved presence threading through the town's everyday life, leaving both investigators and community members to confront the unanswerable question of what had truly happened on that ordinary Sunday when Maria never returned. As months stretched into years, the disappearance of Maria Bennett hardened into a legend within the town, a cautionary tale whispered in conversations and replayed in anxious recollections. The case defied resolution, leaving the community to wrestle with questions that multiplied faster than answers could ever arrive. Detectives, journalists, and private investigators alike proposed an array of theories, each reflecting the uncertainty surrounding her absence. Some suggested kidnapping, envisioning a calculated act by an unseen perpetrator, yet no tangible evidence ever supported this scenario. Others speculated that Maria might have chosen to vanish, leaving behind her old life in search of anonymity or personal reinvention. Both possibilities provoked equal measures of fascination and frustration, feeding an unending cycle of speculation that seemed to echo through the town's streets and into the lives of anyone who had known her. A more unsettling line of thought explored the possibility of ritualistic foul play, drawing on Maria's routine presence at St. Augustine's and the eerie, unexplained occurrences reported afterward. Observers noted the church's quiet hallways, the fleeting scents attributed to her perfume, and the reports of her figure in empty pews, framing a narrative that blended grief with fear. The theory suggested the disappearance was not random but orchestrated, perhaps within a context incomprehensible to those outside it. Law enforcement considered these claims but repeatedly dismissed them as conjecture lacking substantiation, highlighting the gulf between perception and provable reality. Still, for townspeople, the mere existence of such a possibility amplified unease, contributing to a pervasive tension that hung over communal gatherings, worship services, and casual neighborhood encounters. Another approach invoked the concept of spiritual abduction, a hypothesis that drew from psychological analysis rather than physical evidence. According to this view, Maria may have experienced an overwhelming psychological episode, a combination of internal distress and situational pressure that compelled her to walk away into the surrounding wilderness. Specialists debated the likelihood, weighing her personality, her devotion, and her social support, against the intense uncertainty of her disappearance. They acknowledged that even the most grounded individuals could act unpredictably under extraordinary stress, and while this theory offered a framework, it remained hypothetical, untested by any tangible trace of her presence outside familiar spaces. Nonetheless, it captured the imagination of both professionals and laypeople, providing a lens through which to consider a scenario that was simultaneously rational and unsettling. Local historians added another dimension to the speculation, pointing to long-forgotten tunnels beneath the church. These subterranean passages, remnants of construction centuries old, had been sealed and largely forgotten. Enthusiasts suggested that access might have allowed for a discreet hidden exit, possibly explaining Maria's sudden vanishing. Investigators explored the tunnels but found no signs of recent use, and engineering assessments deemed them largely inaccessible. Still, the idea persisted in stories, blending historical curiosity with the pressing need for explanation, feeding public intrigue and perpetuating a sense that the church itself contained secrets yet to be revealed. Maria's disappearance became a focal point in the media, both local and national. Books chronicled the case, analyzing each detail with the meticulousness of true crime scholarship, while podcasts revisited the mystery in serialized episodes, each theory dissected and debated. Online forums erupted with commentary, speculation, and sometimes outright conjecture, the digital echo chamber amplifying every minor observation into perceived significance. The story became emblematic of unresolved vanishings, a touchstone for discussions about missing persons, community vulnerability, and the limits of investigative certainty. For some, the case inspired a sense of vigilance and empathy. For others, it represented a haunting, unsolvable enigma. As the years wore on, the emotional tension intensified, reflecting the duality of hope and despair that had gripped the town from the beginning. Friends and family clung to the possibility of Maria's safe return, yet each passing day deepened the weight of absence, leaving them to navigate grief intertwined with uncertainty. Public perception oscillated, driven by newly surfaced theories, each promising clarity but delivering none. Town meetings, casual conversations, and even casual social media posts carried the residue of this unresolved loss, a testament to the way a single disappearance could ripple across a community, leaving both memory and imagination to fill in the gaps. Investigators continued to monitor every tip, re-examine old evidence, and analyze past interviews. Yet the trail offered little tangible progress. Each new theory, whether grounded in psychological reasoning, historical curiosity, or speculative danger, highlighted the profound complexity of human behavior and the limitations of available evidence. The collective imagination, fueled by both compassion and curiosity, created a multifaceted narrative reflecting not only the mystery of Maria's disappearance, but also the enduring human need to understand the inexplicable. Ultimately, the multiplicity of theories, the ongoing investigation, and the communal reflection transformed the case from a singular event into a persistent symbol. Maria Bennett's absence became a presence in itself, an invisible thread running through the lives of those who knew her, shaping stories, influencing perceptions, and leaving behind an unanswerable question. Theories would continue to arise, evidence would continue to be examined, and the town would continue to live with the tension between hope and despair, never fully resolving the mystery that had begun on an ordinary day at St. Augustine's Church. 4 years had passed since Maria Bennett vanished, yet the memory of her absence weighed heavily on the town, shaping both collective consciousness and private grief. The parish of St. Écarts Boudy Augustines decided to hold a memorial service, a quiet attempt to honor her life and acknowledge the enduring mystery. Word spread among the community, and familiar faces filed into the pews, each carrying their own private ache, the memory of her laughter and gentle demeanor still vivid. Families clutched rosaries, friends whispered prayers, and the congregation collectively attempted to reconcile hope with the unrelenting uncertainty that had defined their lives since that ordinary morning when Maria disappeared without a trace. The service began with measured solemnity, prayers offered in unison, voices rising and falling in ritual cadence. Yet amidst the familiarity of hymnals and candles, a subtle, almost imperceptible aroma began to permeate the nave. It was unmistakable to those who had known Maria, her signature perfume, a delicate blend she wore each Sunday, now ghostly in its presence. At first, people exchanged puzzled glances, questioning whether it was an olfactory illusion, a trick of memory mingled with grief. The scent, however, persisted, lingering near the altar, drifting along aisles where she once knelt, and filling the corners of the church with a presence that seemed both comforting and unnerving. Cameras installed to monitor the service captured the room in its entirety, yet no one could be seen entering or exiting the building during the occurrence. The priest, Father Donovan, described the sensation as disquieting yet familiar. He recounted hearing whispered prayers, soft intonations that echoed Maria's voice, precise in cadence and timbre, yet carried without physical form. The whispers seemed to move among the pews, brushing against ears, inviting reflection, and at times triggering emotional overwhelm. Several congregants, unable to reconcile the sensory experience with rational expectation, fainted or hastily exited the church, overcome by a mixture of awe, fear, and profound sadness. Those who remained attempted to focus on traditional prayers, but the ambiance had shifted, as if the building itself had become a vessel for memory, longing, and unresolved questions. The phenomenon persisted for hours, the perfume's trail weaving through the church before gradually dissipating. Parishioners left with heavy hearts, reluctant to speak, yet burdened with stories they felt compelled to share. The recurrence of Maria's scent reignited discussions that had long been subdued. Had she returned, physically or spiritually? Was this the manifestation of collective grief, a psychological projection shared among the bereaved, or something else entirely beyond understanding? Conversations circulated quickly, blending rational skepticism with the palpable sense of something unexplainable. Local journalists were summoned, reports appeared in both print and online outlets, and social media platforms reignited with commentary, theories, and renewed speculation. Police records confirmed that no intrusions had been logged. Surveillance footage from all entrances to the church during the service revealed no signs of entry, movement, or interference. Forensic investigators were brought in to assess the air quality, chemical composition, and any trace elements. Yet analyses returned inconclusive. There were no residues, no identifiable sources for the aroma, no sign that the perfume had been physically introduced into the space. Even seasoned officers, experienced in the inexplicable twists of missing persons investigations, found themselves unsettled by the event. Their reports emphasized uncertainty, documenting what occurred without offering explanations, adding a new layer of ambiguity to an already confounding case. The memorial service became a catalyst for reflection, both communal and individual. Parishioners described a renewed awareness of Maria's absence as a living presence, something intertwined with memory and space, something that might not conform to conventional notions of reality. Psychologists consulted on the event suggested that the human mind, shaped by grief and expectation, can sometimes generate vivid sensory experiences. Yet, the consistency of multiple independent accounts, alongside the corroborating detail of surveillance and forensic verification, complicated that interpretation, leaving space for doubt and speculation. Discussion within the community turned toward the symbolic weight of the church itself. The building, long central to Maria's life and daily rituals, now seemed more than architecture. It had become a stage for memory, emotion, and unresolved presence. The scent, the whispers, and the unexplainable phenomena reinforced a shared consciousness of Maria's significance, while simultaneously reigniting questions about the nature of her disappearance and whether she remained in some form among them. Families, friends, and investigators alike returned to recollection, attempting to reconcile longing, reality, and the unresolved tension that had never fully lifted from the parish. As the service concluded, there was no definitive answer, only the lingering impression of Maria's essence woven through the ritual space. Conversations persisted long after the last candle flickered out, and the town wrestled once again with fear, grief, and fascination. The event reminded everyone that while facts could be meticulously recorded and timelines reconstructed, some mysteries resisted closure. Maria Bennett's presence, whether literal, symbolic, or psychological, had returned for a moment, compelling reflection and leaving the community to confront the enduring uncertainty that had defined their lives for 4 years. Decades may pass, yet Maria Bennett's disappearance remains a question without resolution. Her sudden vanishing during a routine prayer continues to defy explanation, leaving investigators, parishioners, and the town alike grappling with uncertainty. No suspect has ever been charged, no physical evidence has emerged beyond fleeting anecdotes, and no trace of her life outside those final hours has ever been verified. The church, St. Augustine's, endures as more than a building. It has become a living shrine to her memory, a place where people come seeking closure, connection, or simply to feel the presence of someone lost yet never forgotten. Pilgrims and locals alike speak in hushed tones of subtle movements in empty pews, the sudden impression of eyes watching, and most persistently, the familiar, lingering aroma of her perfume that occasionally surfaces without cause, inexplicable and insistent. Investigators admit the limits of human understanding. Years of inquiry, witness interviews, psychological profiling, and forensic analysis have yielded no conclusive answers, leaving a vacuum of knowledge filled only by speculation and the collective grief of those who knew her. Friends emphasize her devotion, noting she would never voluntarily abandon the routines she held sacred. Yet even the most rational minds struggle with the enduring possibility that something unexplainable occurred. The absence of closure transforms the narrative into a persistent echo, a story retold in classrooms, podcasts, and small-town conversations, reinforcing the town's shared sense of loss and fascination. The church remains quiet and solemn, holding within its walls the memory of Maria's devotion and the weight of unanswered questions. Visitors sometimes pause in the pews she once occupied, inhaling the faint, unmistakable fragrance that seems to curl through the air without source, a sensory ghost that refuses to be ignored. The aroma, subtle yet undeniable, leaves those present with a haunting sense that part of her endures, perhaps in memory, perhaps in spirit, perhaps in some fragment of reality that has never been fully understood. Maria Bennett's story closes without closure, her disappearance a riddle without solution, leaving the town suspended between the tangible and the inexplicable, forever marked by the girl who vanished in prayer.